All right, thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke Media Briefing. I'm Amanda Soliday with Duke University Communications. Today, we will discuss key votes that will soon take place in Congress with implications for the nation's response to climate change. We have three experts here to discuss the proposed measures. Lori Bennear is an associate professor of energy economics and policy at the Nicholas School of the Environment. Her research focuses on evaluating environmental policies and improving techniques to incorporate evaluation into the regulatory process. Welcome, Professor Bennear.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
We also have Tim Johnson from the Nicholas School of the Environment. He studies energy systems planning with a focus on environmental quality and energy consumption. Welcome, Professor Johnson.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
And also joining us is Eric Rolfing. He's an executive in residence at the Duke University Energy Initiative. He formerly served as a senior technical advisor at the US Department of Energy and worked with developing new energy technologies through the, let's see if I can get this right, Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, or ARPA-E. Welcome, Professor Rolfing.
Thank you, Amanda. That is absolutely correct. And now that you've mentioned the acronym, I can just ARPA all day long. So glad to be here.
There we go. All right, Lori Bennear, let's start with you. So Congress is considering some major bills right now, including the infrastructure bill and a $3.5 trillion economic package. It's hard to even talk about that amount of money. How significant are these for our nation's response to climate change?
Well, thanks, Amanda. These bills are critical for our ability to successfully respond to the challenge that climate change presents to the United States and indeed to the entire world. The International Panel on Climate Change report indicates that in order to keep the climate from changing more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases to half of their original peak by 2030. So that is a significant pace of change. And these bills, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which passed in the Senate, and then the budget reconciliation process that's ongoing, provide critical funding that can facilitate both the development of new technologies and the rapid adoption at scale of existing technologies, including solar and wind power and other forms of renewable energy, electrification of durables like cars and water heaters in your home, and other equipment that uses electricity and natural gas. And it provides a lot of funding to really do this at scale and at speed that's required right now to meet this challenge. So it's important to know that while the IPCC report indicates the climate crisis is dire, it's not hopeless, right? I mean, with these kinds of significant investments, the United States can harness the resources we have at our research universities. We're a little biased towards those here at Duke, at our national labs, and in the private sector to actually confront this challenge.
Excellent, thank you. And we'll come back to the speed and the skill required for these efforts. That's a great introduction, thank you. My next question is for Tim Johnson. Would you like to add to anything that Lori said? So if this upcoming legislation passes, how important would this be?
Well, it's important, certainly important as a start. If you think about the sources of US carbon emissions, about 25% comes from electric power generation, almost 30% comes from transportation, another about 23% comes from industry, and then the remainder is from homes, businesses, as well as agriculture. This bill, the infrastructure bill, and then the $3.5 billion reconciliation bill really addresses power and transportation. Some of what it includes gets at industry as well, and homes and that sort of thing. But the big ticket items, address, like I said, power and transportation. Within power, I think the signature the component there is part of the reconciliation bill, and that's what's known as the Clean Energy Performance Plan. And this is a federal level plan that would incentivize clean energy production by US utilities, would actually pay utilities to increase year over year the amount of clean energy that they produce, and actually penalize them if they don't hit certain growth targets in that area. Importantly, the infrastructure bill, which is set for a vote on the 27th, in the Senate, or it sets aside quite a bit of money for grid enhancements, which are critical for increasing the amount of renewable power generation in the U.S. It also sets aside quite a bit of money for electric vehicle charging, and the reconciliation bill also, sets money aside again for grid enhancements, electric vehicle charging. Lori mentioned, transit in areas like that. So both significant. Are they all we need? No. There's always the danger that, should both bills pass, that we'd say, hey, we've done enough, because these are huge political lifts. We're seeing that right now. But as a start, they are certainly the most significant pieces of climate legislation that we've seen, although that's not all that either bill addresses.
Excellent, thank you. That's a great overview. So Eric Rolfing, from a technology standpoint, how important is this moment if we want to reach our decarbonization goals and slow climate change?
Yeah, well, it's a critical moment. We've been treading water, as it were, for some time now. And these bills that are before Congress, and one other that I'll mention, which is the annual budget appropriation, which also has a significant amount of impact on decarbonization. It's just critical. It's a critical time. The technical challenges associated with decarbonization, say we want to decarbonize our energy system by 2050, are significant. We in a developed country like the United States benefit from abundant and inexpensive energy that has been driven by fossil fuels for the last century or more. And now we're trying to completely change that system. One of my ex-colleagues at DOE, Arun Majumdar, who's now at Stanford, likened it to changing the engines on an airplane while we're flying it. It's that challenging. It's an enormous, not only technical, but societal challenge to do this in the time frame of 2050. And so both of these bills, as Tim and Lori mentioned, contain significant buildup of critical infrastructure, whether that's electric vehicle charging or grid modernization. But the annual budget bill also contains a lot of new funding for advanced research and development, whether that's basic science, whether that's applied R&D, new energy technologies, new energy efficient technologies, or also critically important, our public and private partnerships to scale up new technologies. That's one of the major challenges of introducing new challenges into the new technologies in the energy system is getting them up to scale. The scale of energy use is huge, and that makes the challenge even greater. But it's a critical time. We have to move forward, and as Tim and Lori said, it's a great start, but it won't be sufficient, but it's a great start.
Excellent, thank you. I love that analogy with the plane. Now we'll take a moment for questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. You can also post questions via the Q&A window at any time. And thank you to everyone watching on YouTube. So one of our questions, let's get into the specifics a little more. This is a question for the entire panel. What is most promising to you in these bills? Tim, let's start with you on this one.
Okay, thank you. I think the focus on the power sector, the infrastructure bill, again, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, $550 billion, $73 billion that is set aside for grid enhancements, with transmission, electric power transmission grid enhancements. And importantly, it also sets up what they're calling a grid deployment authority, which sounds like another government acronym. But to build out renewables at scale in the US requires moving renewable power where it's generated to where people are. And those two don't necessarily overlap. So building out the power grid is essential to expanding renewables. And there are other challenges related to that. But by setting up a federal coordinating agency. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission handles some of this, but to help break down some of the jurisdictional roadblocks and again coordinate transmission build out. That's significant. So that's in the infrastructure bill, which probably has a better chance of passing right now in its current form than the reconciliation bill, which is still being written. I mentioned before the Clean Energy Performance Plan, under the within the 3.5 trillion, which is just a mind-boggling number, reconciliation bill would itself be really significant. That type of action at the federal level. About 3/5 of the states have what are known as a renewable portfolio standard that do something similar. It's a different mechanism, but the intent is somewhat similar to try to incentivize or require a certain amount of renewable power on the grid. What's being proposed at the federal level under the CEPP, the Clean Energy Performance Plan, would either pay or financially penalize utilities for not generating clean energy. But nevertheless, like I said, at the federal level, if that passes intact, and it's not clear it will, that would be huge.
Excellent. Thank you. Lori, Eric, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, so those two things I would agree with completely. I think we can't underestimate the challenges of the transmission infrastructure that will be needed if we do deep decarbonization. The location where we might put our wind farms, the highest onshore wind potential right down the spine of the Great Plains, right? Terrific wind potential. You got to move all of those electrons to where the people are living in California and in New York and other places. So the current infrastructure is built up to support the fossil fuel-based electricity generation system that we have relied on. And it's not necessarily designed to support the renewable electricity generation that we will have in the future. And there's a lot of not in my backyardness about transmission infrastructure that you understand, right? People don't necessarily want it to go through their neighborhoods or their areas. And there's a lot of jurisdictional sort of veto points. And so as Tim points out, it's really critical that we have some governance structures that can enable these infrastructure facilities to actually get built. I also agree about the Clean Electricity Performance Program. It's interesting just to note that the reason that it's not being just replicating these successful renewable portfolio programs that the states have had is because it's part of this budget reconciliation process. And so it's not a standalone climate change bill, right? It has to go through this budget reconciliation, which means you have to be spending or saving a significant amount of money to qualify to be included in that process. And so rather than just strictly requiring utilities to meet certain renewable electricity standards, they're actually incentivizing it through subsidization, basically. And then I guess just to add one thing, so I'm not just repeating Tim, there is provisions to do more leasing for offshore wind, which I think is potentially quite exciting as well, and has local impacts here in the Southeast, as the southeastern part of the United States is included in that leasing proposal for offshore wind.
Excellent. Thank you. Eric, anything else?
Well, I might just add, and I think Tim had mentioned it and Laurie had mentioned it, included in these bills is extensive infrastructure development for electrical vehicle charging, which is absolutely, every decarbonization scenario that you look at starts with decarbonizing the power system and then decarbonizing transportation primarily through electrical vehicles, especially for passenger scale vehicles. And so, building up that infrastructure, making electrical vehicle charging access amenable and easy for everyone is absolutely essential. Right now, we have to make it as easy to charge your electric vehicle as it is to go to a gas station and fill up your tank. If we don't do that, then we'll never get to the point of the electric vehicle penetration that we need to decarbonize the transportation system.
That's an excellent point. We had a question from James Downing about the Clean Energy Performance Plan. I think Lori may have already answered it. James, will you let us know if that's not the case in the Q&A window? Another question that came up, so this week at the United Nations, President Biden spoke about the urgency of climate disasters. Do you think it's reasonable that we can cut our emissions by 50% by 2030, as the president plans? What needs to happen to meet this goal? Eric, we'll start with you.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an ambitious goal, as is decarbonizing by 2050. And you know, there are various scenarios that tell us exactly how to do that, but it takes an incredible amount of investment, an incredible amount of will, political will and societal will to do it. You know, my specialty is more on the research side, so I might make some comments about some of the aspects of research development that aren't exactly in the bills, but are in the annual appropriations process. That is, you know, whether Congress acts on the reconciliation and the infrastructure bill, they have to, by law and the Constitution, pass a budget every year, which they never do on time, but they do pass a budget. And included in that budget are some interesting things. You know, at the top, Amanda mentioned that I used to work in an organization called ARPA-E, which is the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy. The budget proposal from the Biden administration creates an ARPA for climate, ARPA-C, which is in some ways acknowledging the fact that we're going to have to make systems more resilient. We're going to have to mitigate against climate change, against the impacts, is looking at technologies that make our built infrastructure more resilient, that might do direct air capture of CO2, that might do improved agricultural practices for putting more carbon into the soil, improving soil health and those kind of things. So, you know, on the research side, on the advanced technology side, a lot has to happen. We have to accelerate how quickly we move new technologies, energy technologies or carbon capture technologies, from the laboratory to practice. And that's, you know, that's been a long process for energy technologies. They don't move that quickly. They take decades, and we don't have decades. So accelerating the transition of new technologies into the market is just has to happen if we're to achieve any of these ambitious climate goals.
Thank you. Lori, do you think we can cut our emissions by 50% by 2030?
Well, you know, it's a stretch goal, but the sure way to not do it is to not start, right? And we've been kicking this can down the road for a very long time. I wish we could go back to the 90s and you know, and do things more gradually, but we've missed that window. And so now our choices really are, we can spend money on the kinds of investments to decarbonize our electricity system at scale in a rapid time horizon that are in these bills. We can spend even more money to adapt to climate change because we're unsuccessful in mitigating our emissions. And so we're going to have to live with increased hurricanes and flooding frequency and wildfires and freak ice storms in Texas, right? And have to spend money to essentially adapt to that. And so given those choices, I think that the administration is doing the right thing by focusing on spending money now, making these big investments in research and in science and in infrastructure to meet the stretch goal of reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030.
Excellent, thank you. Tim, anything to add?
Sure, just a couple of thoughts. The Biden administration, under the Paris Agreement, which the US has re-entered, has set a goal as our nationally determined commitment of 50 to 52% reduction in US carbon emissions across the board by 2030 relative to 2005 levels. So the question is, what would these two bills, the bipartisan infrastructure bill and then the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package, do? Well, there have been a few analyses. The Senator Schumer's office released a analysis that said that together they would reduce US greenhouse gas emissions by about 45% over the next 9 years. In other words, by 2030. That's a little bit below the 50% reduction commitment that, you know, at least we have pledged under Paris. That's, you know, if we were to do it, that'd be significant. You know, Eric mentioned R&D needs. That's certainly true. One thing to recognize, though, is what we're talking about here is infrastructure transition. So, you know, most of us own vehicles. There are power plants out there that are burning fossil fuels that are not that new, that still have useful life on them. And, the owners, investors in them are expecting, a return over, more than the next, 8 or 9 years. In other words, we've invested a lot in the infrastructure we have today, and some of that's going to have to be retired prematurely. And so that's, that stranded investment or the sunk cost, and that has to be, dealt with, or at least, people acknowledge it, but that turnover is significant. May not be ready to buy a new car, even though, what we need is more people to buy electric vehicles. And of course, there are subsidies, actually very generous subsidies under the reconciliation bill for things like, EV purchases. If it's domestic manufactured with union labor, you can get up to, it's a little over $12,000, tax credit for electric vehicle, which is, close to half the cost of some of them on the low end. So, just building on what my colleagues here have mentioned, it's together, this gets us close to that 50% target, not quite, but it's certainly an important start.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question that dovetails with something you just said, Tim. So given the time that it will take to fully transition to cleaner fuels like renewables and hydrogen, how do you see the role of fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, playing out in this era? Thank you, Joseph.
Yeah, just at a very high level, if you think about decarbonizing the economy, energy supply and use are not responsible for all of our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, but they are for a significant share. So how do you reduce those emissions? Well, energy efficiency is at the top of the list. Next, you try to electrify everything you possibly can. Transportation, as Eric mentioned, but also buildings to the extent you can, industry. Well, if you're going to electrify things, you need to make that electricity as clean as possible, which really means renewables and all the things you need to do to integrate renewables on the grid. Storage, transmission enhancements, things like that. Beyond that, you have maybe advanced nuclear power. But then the question becomes, what do you do with fossil energy? So under the Clean Energy Performance Plan, there is an emissions limit for what constitutes clean energy. Natural gas with carbon capture. So you're scrubbing CO2 out of the flue gas, combustion gases, or there are other ways you could do it with fuels, is one way. Now, there's really only one significant power plant that's using carbon capture. This is something that an idea has been around for a long, long time. That would be one way that natural gas use could possibly continue under, should all this, as discussed, become law. Significant uncertainties, though, regarding the cost associated with capturing carbon and then storing it geologically. A lot of issues there. So natural gas might have a role in the future. So it's not, we're not saying you can't use natural gas under this under these policies. But it would be difficult for it to continue. Natural gas is, right now, given the power system we have needed to compensate for variable energy, renewable energy resources like wind and solar. California is keeping a few natural gas power plants online just to help balance out renewables there. As storage and other grid changes, storage on the grid increases, as other grid changes take place, that need won't be as critical, but right now it is. And, we're only talking about, 8 years and change here until 2030. I have a hard time seeing us turning off all our natural gas plants that quickly. So I suspect it'll be around. And by the way, other forms of fossil fuels, the Biden administration has set a goal to have all new vehicle sales be electric by 2035. So, there's a role for petroleum, at least through that time, but those are new vehicle sales, and, vehicles remain on the road for, on average, 14, 15 years. So, there will be a role for fossil fuels going forward here.
Excellent.
So Amanda, if I might add to that a little bit with respect to the carbon capture, also, if you look at the decarbonization scenarios, there's always a vestige of fossil fuel use for various reasons, some of which Tim mentioned in the power sector. probably in the transportation sector. You know, we may be able to electrify short haul aircraft, but you're not going to fly transatlantically with an electric plane ever, probably. So you're going to need some kind of liquid fuel for that, some aspects of transportation. I mean, it could be a biofuel, and in many decarbonization scenarios, biofuels are an important component. But in all of these deep decarbonization scenarios, there's always some negative emissions technology, which is at this point as much of a wish as it is anything else. It's a research project to figure out how to do direct air capture, that is to take CO2 out of the air and sequester it in the ground, or to do something like burning biofuels, which are net carbon neutral, and then sequestering the CO2 that comes from burning biofuels to make power. And that's a new emissions technology. And most of these deep decarbonization scenarios have some vestige of fossil fuel use going all the way out to 2050 that's compensated to make it a net zero carbon environment by these negative emissions technologies. And that's an area that they're still in the research stage, and we don't know how to drive those costs down for those technologies, how to ramp them up to scale. Lots of questions still about, you know, where you store carbon dioxide underground. And so, you know, these are significant research questions that have to be addressed, and have to be addressed quickly.
Excellent, thank you. I want to go back to the Clean Energy Performance Plan for just a moment. Are there risks that the plan will cost too much given the regulation of utilities that incentivizes them to spend as much as possible? This is a question from James Downing. He wants to know if that issue can be fixed in the legislation. Lori, since you talked about the plan earlier, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, so I think what the question is that in some states, including North Carolina, the utility rates are regulated by the Public Utility Commission in exchange for giving the utility essentially monopoly power to supply electricity. And that's not true in every state, but it is true in about half the states in the country. And North Carolina is one of them. So the question is, under that structure, essentially they can go to the Public Utility Commission and say, I need to raise my rates to cover my legitimate costs. And my legitimate costs are that I need to get more renewable electricity to meet the standards that have been set. And so it would drive up electricity rates. Actually, one of the interesting things about the approach taken in the Clean Electricity Performance Program is that the funding for that additional cost for renewables actually comes from the program, right? From the government, as opposed to under a renewable portfolio standard, which is the more traditional approach we've seen at the state level that Tim was talking about before, where it's just a mandate. You have to do it, okay? And so then if it costs you more to actually supply electricity from renewables, you would be passing those costs on to electricity ratepayers. And because poor people spend more of their income on a higher percentage of their income on electricity, that's regressive, right? Those additional costs in electricity fall more heavily on poorer households when you do that. One of the sort of exciting things about this approach, right, which is the subsidization approach, is how does it get paid for? It gets paid for from tax revenue, essentially. And at least on the income side, for those of us who make most of our income from things that you get a W-2 for, the tax system in the US is progressive. So it's a different funding mechanism than we typically see with the renewable portfolio standards that have been adopted thus far at the states.
Maybe I'll just jump in and add one thing to what Lori said too. Under the CEPP, the Clean Energy Performance Plan, what utilities can do with the money they receive, is limited. So they can pass it back to ratepayers, in the form of relief, but they just can't pocket it or send it directly to shareholders as a bonus.
Excellent, thank you. A follow-up question. So do we think that cutting carbon emissions through renewables will raise the price of goods and services for the average consumer? Is it hard to know?
I guess there are, in many cases now, wind, solar, and even sometimes paired with storage are cost competitive with fossil equivalents. It's not true everywhere, but where you have good solar, wind resources, that they can be. Those costs have come down, especially solar, just exponentially over the last 10, 12 years, and defying conventional wisdom as it existed around 2010. And so that's encouraging. Now, we're also talking about, orders of magnitude more than we have today. And that poses challenges to, again, the grid. We've talked about that, but even land, building, acquiring land to do this. We're talking about a lot of land for renewables if we expand solar and wind that much. And of course, renewables aren't just solar and wind. You have geothermal, and then there are other forms too. But would they? Yes, to an extent, although there are also subsidies here for renewables. So one of the things that the reconciliation bill does is extends both what's known as the production tax credit and then the investment tax credit for renewables that offsets their cost quite a bit. And likewise, the Clean Energy Performance Plan would, subsidize, effectively subsidize, renewable production. So, we're shifting the burden really to the federal government, and of course, it comes back to taxpayers.
Yeah. I mean, I think, at one form or another, we pay for this, right? And we can pay for it through this kind of investment approach, which is coming out of federal tax dollars. We could pay for it in other ways through increased prices of goods and services, or we can pay for it in terms of, climate damages, right? But, at some level, I mean, I'm the economist, right? There is no such thing as a free lunch. Like we're going to be paying for it. This direct investment approach, I think one of the potential advantages is that because it's a subsidization approach, again, the payment is coming from the tax revenue side and should mitigate the impacts on consumer prices to some extent.
So if I might pile on here, the goods and services question brings up what in my mind is one of the biggest challenges for decarbonization, which is decarbonizing the industrial sector. There's a lot of fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, used for feedstock and process heat in the industrial sector. And some of that may be electrified, but a lot of it may not. And so I think one of the biggest decarbonization challenges going forward will be actually the industrial sector. You can see pathways for, as been discussed by my colleagues, for the power sector, for transportation through electrification, the industrial sector, things like cement. Cement is incredibly carbon intensive. How do we make cement or other building materials with a much smaller carbon footprint? And we don't know how to do that yet. So will that mean that replacement building materials that are carbon free that replace cement are more costly? Probably, yeah. I mean, but as Lori said, what price do you want to pay? Do you want to pay for a carbon free economy that doesn't continue to burn up the world, or do you want to face the consequences of climate change?
Excellent points.
So, sorry, just to add, as we're talking about consumers and industry, one of the concerns with this approach, which is the spending approach, right? So both the infrastructure bill and the budget reconciliation bill, rather than a sort of more comprehensive climate change bill that would then require 60 votes in the Senate, which we don't think we're going to get, and hence we're not going that direction, is you can put a lot of resources out there, but if consumers don't respond to them, it's not clear what we're going to accomplish. So, economists are always arguing we need to put a price on carbon so that it provides the right incentives for people to then buy the electric vehicle or weatherize their house. And yes, the subsidies will help, right? Subsidizing electric vehicles makes it relatively less expensive. And so people might choose to make that decision that way. But, for example, the weatherization program that's in the infrastructure bill, they did that in 2008 and 2009 in the Obama administration with the stimulus package, and they had very little uptake. So they're basically offering poor households free weatherization services, and it didn't really work. And so if we can't get the consumer side right, even if the money's available, it's going to be hard for some of these changes to happen.
Thank you. That's an excellent bridge to the next question. Let's talk about equity. how can elements of these proposals be implemented in a just manner? Like the weatherization plan or solar panel installation or electric vehicles. Lori, let's start with you.
Sure. So the weatherization program is actually is targeted towards households that are lower income or Black, Indigenous, or people of color. They didn't have a huge amount of uptake in it during the last round of this. There's a lot of details that are just missing. I mean, these are budget plans. I mean, these are big pots of money, right, to be allocated. How they actually get allocated is going to determine the justice impacts. But there are at least a few things that we need to really be central as we think about implementation if we want to take this seriously. One, as you mentioned, is really the access question, right? So when people are going around trying to sell you leases for rooftop solar now, they are targeting neighborhoods that are upper middle class or upper middle class. You have to have a credit score above 640. You have to own your own house, right? So all of that effort is just missing. The renters, lower income people with weak credit, right? So there's just not the same kind of access. And so thinking carefully through how we're going to use these monies to actually provide access opportunities for all households is going to be fairly critical. And then there's a rural urban distributional issue as well. It's come up a couple of times as people talk about the amount of land that we're going to need to actually ramp up at scale, things like solar or wind. And then we've talked a little bit about biomass as well. All of those have potential land use implications that are likely to fall more heavily on rural populations. So wind farms, you can actually still, graze cattle and farm the land around the wind turbines. But for utility scale solar, you're taking up the land, right? And for biomass, you're taking up the land for the biomass production, right? Whether it's wood pellets or ethanol or other forms of biomass. So there are pretty significant distributional differences in the impacts of the land use choices that we have to make.
Excellent, thank you. Any follow-up points? Tim, Eric?
Lori mentioned the weatherization programs and being targeted. You see the same thing with electric vehicle charging. Putting money specifically towards residential charging in multifamily housing units. One of the big challenges, most people right now electric vehicles charge at home overnight. Well, that works if you have a home charger, which means you have a dedicated parking space, a driveway, or a garage. A lot of people don't have that, or especially lower income people don't. If they're in an apartment building with a big parking lot, or if they're just relying on street parking. So how do you enable charging for people in that situation? It's not just subsidizing the vehicle; you have to make charging feasible. So part of the money going to charging infrastructure is targeted in that direction. And there are also limits. I mentioned before, the electric vehicle tax credits as well. They're designed so that, there was an income threshold, which is pretty high, but it's still there. And also, you can't use them to buy super expensive luxury electric vehicles.
Excellent, thank you. So another question, what happens if this legislation fails? What does the next few years, decades look like?
If this is our policy window, it's hard to say. Next year is an election year. I would have a hard time seeing Congress taking up a big package like this, although who knows, they might. And then the 2024 election, you sort of have this small little window, within the kind of the presidential election cycle and the congressional cycle too, where you can take on things like this. I just don't know that we'll have the appetite again, in the next couple of elections.
Yeah, and they're doing this with the infrastructure bill, which has bipartisan support, right? So that's great. And then through this budget reconciliation process, where we can only spend money or save money in big chunks. Because they, I think, correctly assess that they're not going to get comprehensive climate legislation through the US Senate. You need to have 60 votes. And I don't think any of us predict, I mean, who knows what would happen with the midterm election, but I don't think that we're going to get 60 votes after that. And so absent change in congressional makeup, I think this is the best shot that people have. And so the consequence of not getting this done is that the US misses its opportunity to avert significant damages from climate change. And we're going to instead have to spend money, either more money later to try to play catch up, or money on adaptation, right? How are we going to live with the significant damages that the International Panel on Climate Change is predicting will happen if we don't reduce our CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Lori and Tim have said. If you look at the past history with respect to US emissions, they've dropped, but that drop has been the result of displacing coal plants with natural gas. And we're gradually coming to the end of that. So, without these bills passing, without any additional funding for the kind of infrastructure and science and R&D we're talking about, that is business as usual. And that business as usual case just keeps emitting carbon and driving the temperature up and suffering the consequences. So this is a window of opportunity, and we have to seize it.
Thank you. Eric Rolfing, this question's for you. What might this legislation mean for new technology and startups? And how about in North Carolina?
Yeah, so I mean, the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill have a lot of infrastructure buildup in them. And so I think there's some opportunities for startups. Again, as I alluded to at the start of this, the regular budget process in the Biden administration has a lot of new opportunities for startup companies, whether it's on the research end or on the public-private partnership end. Here, I think about things like the DOE loan guarantee program, which will be revived in this administration and hopefully well funded by Congress in the annual appropriation cycle. We have to get to the point where small companies can partner, startup companies can partner with the federal government with significant cost sharing to try to see if their technologies will scale. When I was at ARPA-E, I saw, basically a buildup of an incredible entrepreneurial community of inventors for new energy-related technologies, great ideas that got as far as the laboratory and then died because of lack of funding for the next steps. And so I think, maybe not so much specifically in these two bills we're talking about, but in the annual appropriation process, there is significant funding for these kind of public-private partnerships that allow startup companies to take the important next steps. And that has to be part of what the government does to help these companies de-risk their technologies. The climate for venture capital investment in energy technologies is, when ARPA-E started in 2009, it was kind of the peak of clean energy investment. There was a lot of investment in new solar companies, many of which are now bankrupt. And as Tim pointed out, the cost of solar dropped dramatically. We can thank the Chinese for that, whether we want to or not, but we can thank the Chinese for that. And so a lot of those companies just couldn't make it economically. We're in kind of a similar situation now with long duration energy storage, which a lot of people think will be a key for enhancing the penetration of renewables. There's a lot of investment in that now, whether it's rational or not. I can't say. Some are good investments, some aren't. But again, I think the government and funding by the government plays an absolutely critical role in helping these startup companies de-risk their technologies. To see whether they go forward. That was a huge gap we saw at ARPA-E. Startup companies that just couldn't find the critical follow-on investment to start scaling their technologies.
Thank you. Tim, this question's for you. What might the legislation mean for North Carolina? How will it change energy production in the state or public transportation, for example?
Public transportation is probably the easier bit to answer, because again, between the infrastructure bill, which puts $39 billion into transit, that's nationwide, of course, and then a fair amount into electric vehicle charging, and then the reconciliation bill in whatever form it might emerge, does similar things. That money comes right down to communities, and you'll see that whether it's just turning over buses, you're replacing gasoline diesel buses with electric buses, enhanced transit service, things like that, will make a difference. At the kind of the power level, it's harder to say because, again, in North Carolina, as Lori mentioned, we have a regulated utility market. And at the state level, Duke Energy covers most of the state as an investor-owned utility and, has a monopoly right to sell electricity. It makes it a little bit harder for, renewable developers to join the fund, to get in and, connect up to the grid. Not impossible. And Duke Energy has its own plans, to decarbonize, its grid, but it's a little bit more difficult given the regulatory environment that we face here. And of course, there are proposals, discussions out there about changing that, but for the time being, this is where we are.
Thank you. Anything to add to that?
Go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say, I think this funding and these bills for transit systems comes at an absolutely essential time, right? I mean, the pandemic has crippled metropolitan transit systems, and they're a vital part of reducing the carbon footprint in transportation sector. So, as a lifeline for existing transit systems, I think it's really important.
And I was just going to mention again that the inclusion of increased leasing offshore for offshore wind. So most of that is in federal waters. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management actually handles the leasing for that. But the coastal areas off the Carolinas are included in that proposal as well.
Oh, that's interesting. Lori Bennear, this question's for you. How might we be able to tell if these measures in this legislation, if they're working?
Thank you for that. Yeah, so we're about to spend a lot of money if these bills pass. And it would be prudent to make sure that we have some measures in place so that we can see which of these investments worked and which ones didn't. And we're not going to win with every investment we make, right? So it's not reasonable to expect all of them to be a big hit, but it would be helpful going forward to know which ones worked and which ones didn't work. And if you don't put that infrastructure, literally data infrastructure, in place at the beginning, it's impossible to know afterwards what worked and what didn't work. So that involves, as we think about the implementation plan, collecting baseline data and having an ability to track progress over time, understanding what the metrics are that we need to be tracking, and then actually doing the evaluation and making adjustments to our programs afterwards. And we're getting better at that, but we're still not particularly good at it, especially when we're thinking about trillions of dollars potentially being spent.
Yeah, if I might add to that, I mean, frankly, the U.S. government's track record in doing that isn't great. I mean, if you go back to the American Recovery Act, I was in government at the time when that happened, and it engendered a huge amount of bureaucracy and counting all sorts of stuff that didn't matter. So Lori's absolutely right. You have to figure out what it is you need to count that is the right metric that tells you whether you're having success or not. And too often the government counts a lot of things that didn't matter anyway. And I can speak for someone who was in government, it was a real pain. So we want to be able to count the right things and the impact, and ultimately the impact is reduced carbon emissions. And so, we'll quantify that as we normally do, but more specifically, we need to find out if these programs are working, and if they're not, fix them as fast as possible. I mean, as Lori said, these are huge buckets of money. Congress tends to think that the problem is solved once they appropriate huge buckets of money, but that's just the start of the process. You have to implement things correctly, and that's That's an enormous challenge when we're talking about spending at this scale.
Yeah, and I'll just add, much of this reads as a wish list, especially in the reconciliation, bill as it sits now. And I don't think there's been any serious effort to say where do we get the most bang for our buck behind this. So, we've stayed within the context of the bills. If we're thinking about optimal climate policy, or there are other options beyond the kind of targeted spending you see here. Although a lot of it is important. A simple carbon tax or price on carbon emissions, which has its drawbacks, wouldn't necessarily guarantee a reduction in emissions, but at least would let the market determine how to make those reductions.
Thank you. That leads into our final question very well. So for each of the panelists, what's your best hope for climate change measures in the United States? What would success look like in 2050? Eric, we'll start with you for this.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a technologist guy, and so typically that question comes to me and says, "What's the winning technology?" And there isn't one. You hear people talk about the all of the above approach. I think that's absolutely the right answer. We're going to need a range of technologies. On the power side, we'll need renewables. We'll need some burning of fossil fuels with some carbon capture. I don't know how much. I think we'll need advanced nuclear as well, for this kind of firm carbon-free power source. On the transportation side, electrification, once you clean up the power system, will get us a long way. I think 2050, if we're not pretty close to net zero, we've failed. It's an enormous challenge, as particularly some of the industrial processes of decarbonizing those. So there are a myriad of on the technology side of things that need to be developed rapidly: long duration energy storage, carbon capture mentioned, improved biofuels, cultivation of biofuel crops that don't impact food production, just a litany of things. And as I think Lori or Tim pointed out, the first step is efficiency. None of the decarbonization scenarios, they all start with a significant chunk of that decarbonization coming from efficiency gains. And some of that is technical, but frankly, a lot of that is behavioral and societal changes that are required. So, everyone needs to replace their fossil fuel burning furnaces with efficient electric heat pumps in their homes, start driving EVs, et cetera. So, I think we can do it. But as we've discussed before, if we don't get started immediately with a big push, it's going to be very hard.
Thank you. Tim, would you like to go next?
Sure. I mean, Eric put it very well. The only other thing I'll mention, I'm uncomfortable with just undisciplined spending. You get in trouble at the household level if you do that. You get in trouble at the national level, at least in theory, if you do it in the longer term. But if we were to, if both these bills were to pass, that's a lot of spending that would create jobs. I mean, there's an economic stimulus in there as well. You're talking about, a lot of boots on the ground type jobs, and that's employment. So, there at least would be that upside. And the estimates on what the economic or employment benefits would be vary a lot. Maybe Lori could say something about that as an economist. Fortunately, it's not my area, but nevertheless, there are kind of benefits. You're really what you're talking about here isn't just changing the energy system. You're talking about changing the economy, and there's a lot of disruption, as we've mentioned, but you create opportunities as well.
Indeed. So I'll just, I guess, add a little bit that I agree. Tim mentioned a carbon tax, and Eric mentioned that a lot of this is behavioral. I don't think we can just spend our way to this, because at the end of the day, we are going to be relying on lots of individuals making lots of decisions. And so if we could get the incentives right on that side by pricing carbon, I think it would help. But politically, I mean, there's just, the will's not there at the moment. And so I guess what I'm hoping success looks like is we have some big investments on the science and technology side and on the infrastructure side, and we get some wins, and people start to see like, oh, I actually can drive an electric car, and I'm not going to get stranded on the side of the road, and people's views start to change, and it creates a little bit more political space. Maybe this is too Pollyannish, but it creates a little bit more political space for us to then do the other things that we're going to need to do to complement this kind of big investment in infrastructure and R&D. And then Tim threw the jobs one to me. It's really hard. All of those jobs estimates are just that, estimates with lots of uncertainty. Also because a lot of times it's sort of construction or the initial phase where the jobs happen and then they don't necessarily continue. Then you have to compare that to the jobs that people had in the fossil fuel industry. It's not exactly clear, except that the economy, if we're successful, will look different. People will be working differently and in ways we can't even imagine. But there will be systemic change from this for all aspects of work.
I hope that's true. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to our panelists for sharing their perspectives. If you'd like to attend future Duke media briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu. That's dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, please stay well, and thank you.